Today, I'm excited to welcome Dan Siroker to the Unstacked Startups Podcast. Dan is the co-founder and CEO of Rewind AI, which is quite literally building a digital brain. From his contributions at Google in the early days, to his work with Obama's campaign, to co-founding Optimizely, which he grew to $120 million in ARR and 450 employees, Dan is a true pioneer in tech and AI. As CEO of Optimizely, Optimizely was voted the #1 best place to work by the San Francisco Business Times. And in 2022, Rewind AI won Product Hunt's Golden Kitty Award for Most Innovative Product. In this episode, he shares his journey, the inspiration behind Rewind AI, and his thoughts on the future of AI in augmenting human potential. I hope you enjoy. Dan, thanks so much for taking the time with us and joining the Unstacked Startups Podcast. How's your morning going?
It's going great. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Maybe a good place to start is your journey to entrepreneurship. You are the co-founder of Optimizely. Today, you're the co-founder and CEO of Rewind AI. Maybe fill the audience, myself in on your early career and high level. How did this all come to be?
Yeah, and I think it began, if I've reflected on this question a lot, I think it began when I was probably in first grade, and my parents instilled in me this idea that I had a mind of my own. And they really wanted me to think for myself, to question everything, sometimes very much to their dismay. And ultimately, that really is kind of my defining character, and I found entrepreneurship as the most meaningful mechanism to think for myself, to have a mind of my own, to explore ideas that other people think are crazy. One of the foundations of all of the most successful things I've done has been some combination of really compelling demo that like pushes the limits of what people think is possible with technology. And that's just really stuck with me. And my journey through entrepreneurship, every time I've looked at anything I've done of any worth, it's been sort of thinking for myself. I joined Obama's presidential campaign when he was polling third in the Democratic nomination in 2007. My first startup I founded to compete with Google and Adobe and ultimately beat them in the market of what we're doing. And those all came from that drive. And I don't know why that's there. I mean, I go back and I think it's probably because my parents really instilled this idea of a mind my own. But that's still to this day drives me more than anything else.
That's fascinating. It's almost this curiosity, this natural, inclination to push what your mind is telling you and to give things a shot and to take risk and take chances.
Yeah, I think very much so. I think it's rooted in maybe this realization I have, or this belief I have, that most people have a very narrow view of technology, of their own limitations, of what's possible. And that's very pessimistic. I'm an optimistic person. I want to show how technology can do so much more than you've ever imagined for you. And that's what drives me. It's this idea of like, I don't think people really can realize that until they see it. And when they feel it, that's what just gives me energy.
It's actually a good, segue into, maybe we'll start with Rewind AI, which is what you're working on today and how that has come to be. And in some ways, having a mind of your own is very applicable to what you're building at Rewind AI. But before diving deep into it, how did you come to Rewind AI? What's the desire in you, the why in terms of you deciding, hey, I'm going to sink my teeth into this and I'm going to potentially spend the next 10, 15 years of my life building this?
Yeah, it started when I gradually lost my hearing in my 20s. And I tried a hearing aid when I turned 30, and it was magical. It felt like gaining a superpower. And ever since that moment, I had been on a hunt for ways that technology can augment human capabilities and give us superpowers. And let me explain why it felt like a superpower, because I think this is something that's hard for people to relate to. Maybe if you're poor vision, put glasses on, you can kind of understand. But it was really the simultaneous realization of, wow, I can hear again. And even more awe-inspiring was this idea of how bad it had gotten, and I hadn't even realized it. It really goes back to what I said earlier around kind of my core belief of questioning every assumption. I had assumed this is as good as it gets. I had assumed, this is how my hearing is. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. And once you go from pretty poor hearing to getting it back, it like unlocks this whole realization of what are the other limits in my life? What are the other things that I have been just going along and assuming is how biology and how I exist in this world, how that is to be. And that's what that really got me inspired to think about other ways that technology can augment human capabilities, other ways that we can push the limits of the best analogy is like a horse with blinders, or even better is, I don't know if you've seen this on Twitter/X. There's this video of an experiment people did where they put fleas in a jar, and the fleas are bouncing up and down, and they put a lid on the jar. It's like a mason jar. They put a lid on the jar, and after about a day or two, you can take the lid off the jar, and the fleas stop jumping any higher than the top of the jar. Not only that crazy, but they pass this trait on to their children, their progeny. None of them ever tried jumping higher than the jar, even though the lid's no longer there. And so that's how I think a lot of humans live their lives. They go through their life not realizing there's these metaphorical jar lids that have been placed on us by society, by ourselves, by our own biology. And that's what motivated me to start Rewind, is how do we really push those limits?
Fascinating. So if you were to try to distill this down for the average person in terms of whether that's today or a few years out, how would the average user, how would the average individual use a platform, a tool like Rewind AI?
Yeah, I'll start with like the key reason why, the benefit. And the main benefit is ultimately it allows you to focus your time on your true purpose, on the things that give you energy, not spend your time on things that an AI can do for you. So if you think about your day, just go back and reflect on, yesterday or the day before. What are all the things in your day that an AI that can think like you and an AI that can act like you, not an AI that competes with you, but an AI that can think like you and an AI that can act like you can do for you? And examples might be, writing. If you're going to write an email to somebody, it's much harder to start from a blank piece of paper and from nothing than starting from a draft. If AI can create a draft for you that, is 90% right, that's so much easier, saves you so much more time. And if that draft of an email uses the context of your past, the things you've seen, the things you've said, the things you've heard, your existing relationships with people, then that's incredibly powerful, because I said our memories aren't that great. Machines' memory is pretty great. Like if for example, on our website, we show an example of a real example of our product drafting an email to Sam Altman from me asking to catch up. And it uses these little nuggets of our past. It says, hey, I recall fondly being introduced 2010 by Paul Graham. Thanks for being an investor in Optimizely, and as an investor in Rewind, these are the key things that you might be interested. And it because it's able to use those moments from your past, which is what Rewind collects and captures for you, it's able to generate such a personalized, such a powerful draft that you otherwise wouldn't have to write. So that's the core idea, is like the things in your day, the things in your life that you don't want to spend time on, you don't need to spend time on, an AI can do for you. And then that gives you more time to do things like spend time with your family or pursue more creative endeavors.
So Dan, you have this, you are losing your hearing. You clearly have a desire for humans to, gain superpowers and augment maybe where they're not as strong. You have this idea. How does this turn into a viable product? Can you take me through that journey?
Yeah, it certainly entailed many zigs and zags. This is, the process that often is described as navigating the idea maze. This is something that one of our largest investors, Andreessen Horowitz, likes to see founders demonstrate, is that they've really thought through all the different twists and turns in and around this idea. So the very first version of what we built was actually nothing like what we do today. It was a bot that joins meetings. It was called Scribe, and it would transcribe meetings, Zoom meetings. And at the time, this was March 2020, or a few months after, so the pandemic was causing a lot of folks to move to Zoom. And we thought, wouldn't it be great to pair the best of video conferencing Zoom with really great voice transcription? We built that and got actually quite a bit of success, and it was growing nicely. And then the M1 came out, the Apple M1 chip, which enabled us to do a lot of the heavy lifting on device, which allowed people to now start capturing more than just meetings, which was sort of the key insight and frankly, enabling technology to do what we do today. So by switching from Scribe to a product that captures more comprehensively everything you've seen, said, or heard, that unlocked a whole bunch of use cases we never even really imagined. So that's how we ended up where we are today. And even now, we were exploring many other paths forward that can even more comprehensively deliver on this vision. But that's, I think the lesson there for other founders is kind of counterintuitive. But the lesson is, you should be just as afraid of success as you are as of failure, because we were kind of successful with Scribe. Most founders probably wouldn't have pivoted from Scribe to Rewind because it was going okay, it was going well. But I think you have to be careful that if something is doing just okay, you might end up working on it, and the opportunity cost of your time is precious. You might keep working on it for years and years before you realize there's bigger opportunity. So when new technology comes along, especially things like new hardware or new capabilities like large language models, it's always a good idea to step back and ask yourself, should I be afraid of my success so far? And is there a different path that might be better than the one I'm on today?
There's so much out here today on AI. There's so many tools, so many different product startups that are coming up and branding themselves as AI enabled or AI tech startups. What makes Rewind different from AI ventures in the market, in your opinion?
Yeah, we're different in two regards. So the one major difference in the way we talk to investors and what got them excited about our company was kind of on a two. If you think about AI startups in kind of a 2x2 grid, on one dimension you've got capital intensive, another one you've got not capital intensive, and another dimension you've got sort of proprietary data versus generic data. We're kind of in the sweet spot where we've got this amazing proprietary data, everything you've seen, said, or heard, and we're not that capital intensive. We're not training large language models. We're actually using the large language models, the best state of the art stuff that comes out it seems like a new model every day, and pairing that amazing reasoning engine with the data that we have, which is no one has. No one has everything you've seen, said, or heard, not even Google, not even Microsoft. So that was what makes us really unique from sort of the investor lens. From the user's lens, I think there's a lot of assistance out there. There's a lot of AI assistance, book me a trip from, San Francisco to New York, those kinds of generic tasks. Where we are very unique is that we are one of the only really personalized AIs that can think like you and act like you. So it's not about just doing tasks for you. That's where we try not to use the word assistant, because sometimes that gets conflated with this idea of like doing generic tasks. But it's things like draft me an email to Sam Altman asking to catch up using the context of my past. Very few companies out there can do that. And that's what also makes us very unique in AI, is that we're this personalized version of AI that uses the context of your past.
So if I'm going about my everyday, in a future state here, and I'm wearing Rewind pendant, it's hearing my conversations, it's storing my data, it's capturing my memory and storing it in a way better way than my brain ever could. Are there privacy topics around that are, I assume that are very relevant to this, ethics? I'd love your take on that. How do you see that stuff playing out?
Yeah, it's the top thing we think about, and not just privacy, but like, is this good for society? And I think the latter I'll take first, which is most people go through their lives forgetting what's being said, what's being heard. Oftentimes that's good, but more often than not, I think the things that actually are really causing damage in society, gaslighting, saying one thing to one person, then the other, and sort of narcissistic personalities that those really toxic people, in a world where people can actually remember what they've said, be able to go back to it, call them out when appropriate, I think is actually good for society. Like, I personally operate under the assumption anything I've ever said to anyone in any conversation is going to go out to anyone else that I've ever said. So I don't think about playing politics. I don't think about saying one thing to another person and talking behind somebody's back. But that's not the case for many people. And I think those people will have a rude awakening, not just from products like ours, but many of the other AI wearables. Will change the way those people can operate in society, and I think that's good for society. The second, on privacy, we very much believe that the pendant will need capabilities upfront from day one that are that respect the privacy of the people you're around, and so we are building features that are good not just for you, the wearer, but good for the people around you, so they get benefit. They have control. They can see when it's recording. They can see when it's not. It's not a covert recording device. And ultimately, it's the kind of thing that we want somebody to wear proudly. And when somebody asks, hey, what's that thing around your neck? They have a story they can tell. And we're still crafting exactly this. And I won't share it today, but it's going to be very compelling about why this is good for me, the person wearing it, why it's good for you, the person I'm with, and why this is good for society. So we think all three of those check boxes need to be checked for this product to be a hit.
Obviously, you and I are, optimistic. We probably wouldn't be if we weren't working in this industry, but I can imagine that for folks who maybe aren't as technologically savvy or aren't as comfortable, that'll be a hurdle to get over. And if you can do it, it'll have huge, hopefully very positive implications for so many people.
Yeah, I mean,
Kind of the net. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
everything you just said could have been said when the telephone came out. In the telephone, when it first came out, the first major objection to the telephone was privacy. And the reason why was the V1 of the telephone you had to go to the general store to use, and people could eavesdrop. Then, even when it came to your home, you had this issue of eavesdropping switchboard operators. So it wasn't until the technology, until the phone got good enough that you didn't have to rely on the general store, you didn't have to rely on switchboard operators, that it became normalized and mainstream. So everything you just said could have been said of that device in that category. And that's where we're going. We're trying to build the equivalent of the telephone post switchboard operator. And if we do that, then I think it's going to be something that's not just good for the user, the wearer, but unequivocally good for everyone around them and for society.
Fascinating. I think there was a similar sort of analogy when humans were getting around by horse and buggy,
Yes.
and it was
Yes.
transitioning to automobiles and everything else. There was massive pushback.
Yeah.
People loved their horses and they were a part of the family, and there was pushback on innovation, and it takes time for people to adapt, but hopefully it's for the better.
Yeah. A great example of that, the same story said today, is self-driving cars. People love their cars. They love their status quo, but they're still, just like self-driving cars and before regular cars. I actually coined this acronym to describe what happens in society for any breakthrough technology that ultimately gets mainstream adoption. It goes through 4 stages. It goes through the acronym spells out SAFE. It's initially this shock, like, whoa, like, how does this thing do this? Then it's awe, like this admiration of, wow, I can't believe human society has gotten us to the point. And then it's fear. It's like, can this thing kill me? And eventually it becomes expected, and expected in such a way that feels so hypocritical, because the people who are the biggest critics just a stage earlier are now just the biggest fans. And sort of like, a good example is probably like airplane Wi-Fi. Like, as soon as you had it the first time, you're like, I can't believe I can use the internet on an airplane. And like the very next flight, you're like, why isn't this thing fast enough? And so I think those are the kinds of transitions and stages that inevitably any breakthrough technology goes through. So we're going through that now with AI wearables.
For sure. Where do you think we are in that sort of cycle here with generative AI and everything that's gone on over the past year and a half?
Yeah, I think we're safely in the fear stage. I think there's a lot of people worried about, P doom, the probability of doom, and AGI accelerating in faster. I think AGI, by the way, is inevitable, and probably some machines already demonstrate AGI, and we're actually much closer to AGI than people think. But it's going to be much less scary to society, and will take much longer to displace so much of the status quo. I do think probably half of all jobs will go away after AGI can replace them. But many new jobs and many new jobs, maybe even the wrong word, many new vocations, many more things that people can do will come up that will be even more exciting than the things we've done in the past. And then you just have to look at the history of technologies. It's happened over and over again. And AGI is just the latest, flavor.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I like to think that as humans, we're resilient and we're adaptable, even though in the moment it may not feel like that. We're resistant to change and everything else. But if you take the long arc of history, we're resilient. You know what I mean? I mean, you and I and our ancestors have been around for hundreds, thousands of years, and we've adapted through all these different technical innovations and different things and societal changes and whatever else. And
ironically, the reason we're so resilient is because we make tools. And one of the best tools we've made is large language models. And so the idea that we should be afraid of the tool that we just created that can give us so much unlimited productivity and potential, it's almost like the most counterintuitive reaction you could have, because the reason we survive and resilient is the tools we make. And that's just, the idea that now this tool will sort of go Terminator 2 style and, become self-aware and Skynet and kill us all is kind of, I think, a leap too far for me.
Yeah. And I think you're very spot on. I mean, look, roles, vocations, the way people work today is obviously going to change. You know what I mean? And maybe a question for you on that, as you're building a, potentially transformative AI technology company here, are there skill sets or things that you think the best people in the future, will have as they leverage AI versus today? Are there, I hear about critical thinking, and that combined with AI is very powerful. Are there other skill sets, traits that you think are particularly important?
I think it's the willingness to accept a new way of working. I'll just look at, programming, software engineering, something I studied in computer science. I've built, almost always the first version of every product I've ever founded the company for. And that job and profession is fundamentally changing. What used to be 80% of your time was the drudgery, the boilerplate, the integrating with APIs. That's the easy part to automate. And I think you need to, and more than anything, the thing you need to survive in a world where AI is so powerful is that sort of adaptability, that open-mindedness, that willingness to say, okay, the thing that I thought my job was is now different. I'm still a programmer, but I spend my time on things that are thinking about the system writ large, and the maybe I'm closer to the user and understand the problems, and less close to the details of like how we actually implement a lot of the things that Copilot can implement for me. So I just think there's a shift. There's not just jobs going away, but existing jobs transforming dramatically. And if you're clinging to the past, and if today you are a programmer and you're listening to this, and you're not spending half of your time asking Copilot or a system like that questions of the code and asking it to help you, then you are far less productive than somebody who is. Even if you're a very experienced engineer, it's these things that there's so much of your job that you don't need to be doing that AI can do for you. That's I think the most important thing, is to have that mindset and to open your eyes to ways to do your job in a different way that ideally is better and more productive.
Fascinating. Yeah. For you, who as a software engineer, had coded, built products for many years without, obviously, as this is a new sort of advancement, leveraging generative AI and everything else, it's got to be fascinating to sit here and play around with Copilot while coding and building something and seeing what you can do and what you can't do and the way that it's changing. And I echo what you said. I think that, a lot of what we do at Stacked SP, which is building teams for venture-backed tech startups, and a lot of those folks are highly technical. And what we're finding today is that there was always an importance on hiring great people and great software engineers and everything else, but it's even more important today. The ones that can leverage and work with AI and play off of it to make them not just 5x as productive or 10x productive as the average players, but now so much more productive. Obviously, I think that it does probably elevate folks who may not have been top performers, but I don't know if it elevates them as much as top performers. I don't know if you have an opinion on that or a thought, but something I think about a lot.
Yeah, I think I don't know if it makes that meaningful difference in terms of an individual's performance. It tends to be people are low performance for lots of reasons, but if the core reason they're low performance is that they make bad decisions, they're not, they don't have, they don't have that right perspective on what to do. How you do that with AI, I don't think is going to help that much better. You can do the wrong thing with AI faster, but it's still the wrong thing. Where I think the biggest difference actually happens is the difference between the impact a senior software engineer can have versus a principal engineer. Like a senior engineer who's got maybe 4 or 5 years of experience, they're actually maybe more productive and better fit for your company because they have high agency, they don't know what they don't know, than somebody who's got 15 years of experience. And I used to think that, and we actually started Rewind very much with this philosophy of hire very experienced people who've been there, done that, use a wealth of experience, pay them well. But now I'm starting to see there's just as big an opportunity to hire people. You're straight out of college. Even then, you still AI may not be. You don't know how to wield it the right way. But it's the sweet spot. I think is that senior level, been there 4 or 5 years. They've seen some things. They know different company cultures. They have very high agency, and their willingness to try new things. As you get more experience, you've 15 years of experience. You're kind of stuck in your ways. You've done it really well, successfully. The reason you're at that level in your career, the principal level, is because you've done it a certain way. To then rethink the way you do your work is much harder than somebody who's only been at it for 4 or 5 years. So that's where I think the biggest impact is going to be on performance, is those great high agency individuals who got just, let's say 5 years of experience. They're now going to be just as effective and productive as somebody who's got 15 years of experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a good segue into, reflecting on, I think, both Optimizely and Rewind AI, when you think about the early teams or your leadership teams, are there common patterns, threads, traits that you think are of note for others out there who are trying to push the envelope and build something great?
Yeah, it's amazing how the early team in a company really shapes where it ends up. At Optimizely, we got more lucky than good. We had these amazing sort of stem cells, people we were hired because at the time I didn't have a track record, I didn't have a prior successful exit. So we hired people we could hire. I couldn't go out and hire the kind of people I'm able to hire today. And we just got very lucky. I mean, they all ended up, now they're all doing, if you look at sort of the diaspora of those early hires, they're all doing incredible things. It feels kind of like a mafia of people that we got lucky to have there. We shared one time together in this earth where we could actually work together. So I do think that helped us a lot. I do think you should. That's hard to create, is that luck. But I think part of it is maybe looking for people with the right mindset more than you are looking for people with the right experience. I've always said that I'd much rather hire somebody who's 100% culture fit but has 80% of the experience to do the job than somebody who's got 80% culture fit and 100% of the experience to do the job. Because you can coach the experience, you can teach the experience, they'll get the experience by doing the job. The culture and the fit and the agency and the mindset is very, very hard to coach or change. So that would be my biggest advice, is like, don't, if given two candidates, you're debating between the two, choose the one that's the better culture fit, not the one that happens to have maybe a few more years of experience doing the job that they would be doing at your company.
Yeah. I almost think of it as like you're hiring not necessarily just for now, but for the future. And you know that at a tech company that's pushing the envelope, literally pushing the envelope, you need people who are adaptable, who are not afraid of failure. Also, as we've learned in this conversation, not afraid of success either, that have high agency, that are intense in a positive sense, probably are optimistic, are the right DNA traits typically. Obviously, different companies are different and have different molds and different, everything else. But I think those are some worthy common threads. You're an experienced entrepreneur at this point. You've built, some amazing things. And, there are a lot of young people out there, maybe we would hope that there would be more. I know there's been a little bit of online banter around, hoping that there'd be more young people building great startups or being more entrepreneurial, and why is it? But that's for a different day's conversation. What advice would you have for young aspiring entrepreneurs? What would you want them to know?
Yeah, I think there's, I have a long list, and if you follow me on Twitter and /X, I've got a long set of examples that follow the pattern of, first time founders X, second time founders Y, and where, X and Y are somehow, there's some insight, some delta between the two that sort of gets to a key insight. And the reason I think those really take off and go viral is because I've made both mistakes. I've done the X when I was a first time founder, and now I've, fixed it the second time. One example is, first time founders brag about how many employees they have. Second time founders brag about how few employees they have. This is a very insightful one because it really talks to ego and pride and what motivates you. I remember at Optimizely feeling really proud of saying, "Oh yeah, we got 450 people." But that's so artificial. If anything, by making that the thing you brag about, you end up overhiring. You end up, focusing on the wrong things. And so I would my biggest meta advice is to really think through what motivates you, what drives you. For your company to succeed, it needs to be the company you want to work at in 10 years or 20 years. It's not enough to have something that gives you energy in the short term. It needs to be something that sustains you. I think a lot of founders make the mistake, and there's a lot of hustle porn out there, which is like, "Oh, I worked so hard, I slept on my chair last night," and I think people get this mistaken idea that that's what being an entrepreneur is. But it's the same mistake that bragging about how many employees you have. It's fake. It's vanity. It's not actually what makes the company succeed. If I look back at Optimizely, I worked my ass off because I didn't have kids at the time. I was just working. I made up for lack of prioritization by just more hours. But if I look at myself today, if I took my body, my ability to be a CEO that I am today, where I'm ruthlessly focused with my time, I got 3 young kids, I'm at home at dinner every night at 5 o'clock, if I took that ability to prioritize how I spend my workday today and put it in my body and optimize it, boy, would I have been infinitely more successful, more productive. And I think that's what you need to recognize is how do you live a sustained life as a founder that if you're going to build something of any impact or meaning, you're going to be doing for multiple decades, not just a few years.
Being able to prioritize on what's important, being able to focus on that, double down on it.
Yes.
I think
My
that's
advice on
right.
that is I have this mantra, which is, and I say it both publicly and internally many times a week. I'll say the main thing is that the main thing should stay the main thing. There's a lot of things that can get in the way of the main thing. You don't know until you tell yourself, what is the main thing right now? Okay, this is the main thing. Then once you've defined it and set that boundary, anything that's not the main thing, you should ask yourself, should I be doing that? And this really came from this experience I had at Optimize It, where I was working my butt off. But if I look back at what actually made the difference between us succeeding and failing, it really was like 2 or 3, maybe 4 good decisions, good bets. It wasn't the thousands of things I was doing all the time. Most of that was wasted energy, going to conferences and networking and meeting with investors and all of the things that feel like responding to emails quickly, like all the things that feel like important things to do in the moment. In the end, didn't really make a difference in the ultimate outcome. So I've become much more focused and ruthless with my time because of that learning.
One final question for you here. You've seen, scale and building a team at Optimizely. You're going through it right now with Rewind and everything that you're building. How do you create a culture, an environment where your people are motivated, where your people love what they're building on, outside of just, maybe hiring itself, but are there things that stand out to you in terms of building a great culture?
Yeah, I think it starts with it. I think about this a lot. I think it starts with defining what you mean by culture. And I define culture as the sum of the way we treat each other and make decisions. It's very much shaped by your early team and eventually by your stated mission, vision, and values. I look at Google, where I used to work back when it was like cool to work at Google, exciting, but 2005, 2006, everyone wanted to work at Google, but they made the mistaken assumption that the reason they wanted to work there, and I think Google made the mistake of thinking, it's because of the perks, ping pong and the lunches and the snack bars and micro kitchens and the great restaurants. But I think, and in fact, the thing that drove me nuts when I was at Google is I interviewed probably 2,000 people in my 2 years there, every day, multiple interviews. And every person I interviewed, I had to assess how googly they were, like how much of a culture fit. But nobody defined googly. Nobody had a definition for it kind of meant irreverent or maybe a little, independent minded, but it wasn't clear. It wasn't like a clear definition. So I knew at Optimizely, at least I wanted a definition. What are our values? And we actually had at Optimizely an acronym we used to remember this: Optify: ownership, passion, trust, integrity, fearlessness, and transparency with a Y at the end. And we every candidate we looked at, we said, at least, even if we weren't going to choose the right culture values, we wanted to be consistent. And what I found, the reason I actually did this very acutely, was I started to see in the early days when we were about 30 people would start rejecting candidates because they weren't a culture fit. But that was actually kind of a bias against, they just weren't like me. And that actually it was kind of this unconscious bias. I don't think people did it maliciously, but it was like, they just didn't feel like they were a culture fit. But without being explicit on what the criteria for culture fit was, you couldn't really say that objectively. So we did that. That worked phenomenally well. And then at Rewind, we took it to the next level. We have a whole culture memo. This is all public. If you search my Twitter, you find the culture memo. It's listed. Actually, it's linked off of our careers page, where we have a much longer list of cultural values that generally fall into 2 categories. One is impact, the other is teamwork. And not only do we use this when we assess candidates when we hire them, but every quarter we do a 360 of each other, very lightweight, takes about 15 to 20 minutes for each person, where we assess each other on how we live up to our culture values. I get that feedback from my team. I give that feedback to others. And that's also critical to building the right culture that's very purposeful. Because if you don't do it, you're going to have a culture that goes in a direction you don't want. You have to really be purposeful. It's going to exist whether you define it, whether you focus on it. So I recommend defining it and focusing on it.